Hi, welcome back to the Busy Corner. This is lesson 16. Today I'm going to show you how to make a shaped crown hat. I held this up in lesson 12 and today I'm going to show you how to do it. This I'd made for myself and I put on 32 stitches and I knit 5.5 inches deep, and I think it's still a little too big actually because I don't want it pushing down this far. And what I'm finding is these stretch out after about a week, so the one I made for myself, the 34 stitches around, was too big, and so is this one, the 32. But I think some of it had to do with my depth. But experiment for yourself, and it depends on the yarn. Hometown USA, I'm finding, stretches out quite a bit and it doesn't go back. So, anyway, before we do that, I hope you saw my description on lesson 12, where I show you or tell you that I'm finding that PEX is really hard to work with for making your knitting hoops. I suggest a different product. It is called polyethylene tubing. It is sold in the plumbing department on a roll. You'll have to have them cut the length you want. It is used for ice maker tubing, so it's safe to hold in your hand. And this will bend into the shape you want without heating. You'll still need wire inside, and I suggest you do this. If you take your wire, and I use 1/8 inch steel wire. This is a 9-inch piece. I've already bent it a little bit because I took it out of some PEX. So if you'd like, you can buy 1/4 inch polyethylene tubing and put this inside this. And this polyethylene, the 1/4 inch, will help to center it inside your bigger pipe. So put this inside, then take your cutters. You can also use sharp scissors that are meant to cut sturdier material. And be sure you don't cut into the wire, obviously, or you'll dull your cutters. They won't do that. So, cut your tubing. If you want to, you can take the writing off, or if there's a little rough spot. It doesn't matter because it's going inside now your other polyethylene tubing. And you want to insert that so that you have enough space on either end, and I just use the end of a pen or anything to push that down in there. You want to leave enough space on the end, so that's why I cut my wire 9 inches, and the polyethylene for the outside piece is going to be basically 10. So you can mark it beforehand. I didn't, because I'm just eyeballing it. Cut your polyethylene tubing with your cutters. Then, instead of plugging it with glue, if you have some of these at home, they're $1.88 for a 15-count box. They're called 3/8 inch flathead plugs, and they'll be in the wood department where the dowel rods are. They are meant to fill a countersunk hole, but they fit in your tubing very nicely. So take your narrow end. You can see, I don't know if you'll be able to see it. It's kind of angle cut. So take the smaller end and put it in your tubing. It'll start easy because it's angled. Then take your end of your pen or something like that. Don't use something sharp because you'll cut yourself. And push that down into your plastic. Down into your plastic tube. And do the same thing on the other side. Again, put the smaller end in first. That'll make it easy to start. And then shove it in with your pen. And guess what? You're done. Didn't have to glue it or anything. Now you can bend it to the shape you want. I suggest, again, something like a teardrop shape that's easy to hold. And this polyethylene is a little slicker than the vinyl. But the vinyl, the clear, that's nice to start out on or for certain types of yarn. Anyway, with a little bit of bending, now I'm done and I've made a nice tube. If you want to, you push it in there a little farther if it rattles around. I think these are going to stay without glue because you'll see that they bulge the plastic out just a hair. So I think they'll stay in there just fine. The inside plastic, the 1/4 inch tubing, I put it inside first. Probably isn't totally necessary, but looks better in the clear, and it gives it a little more body to the plastic. And you're finished. Now, the second thing is, I had an email this week from Patricia who said knitting on the hoop was really hurting her back. And she came up with a really good idea. She said she had some locking bowls with lids that she bought on QVC that had a handheld hold inside. And that got me to thinking, so I came up here and I just stacked up a bunch of cardboard. There's, I don't know how many pieces here, it was just a box. But it's 1 inch thick of cardboard, and I taped it all around. Then I took my razor knife and I cut out a opening inside that I think is about 3.5, let me measure this. It's 3.25 by about 3/4. And taped it all around there with package sealing tape so that it wasn't, so the cardboard wouldn't flake off onto the knitting. And now you have a little holder. I think it would work better if it were deeper. So that made me experiment with a little box I had. This is just a little wooden box from the craft store. You will see that I'm not going to be doing a busy corner on painting, so disregard my decorative painting there. But the point being, this little box is perfect for storing your little hoops. And all I did was take some trim board and I hot melt glued it together so that I had an opening that's about 3.5 by about 3/4, and hot melt glued it together, hot melt glued it to the box, and made myself a nifty holder and knitter, and I can just stick my hoop right into there. Now, I'm going to make another one that is slightly deeper and slightly longer, and then it'll be even better. Because once your knitting gets heavy, it wants to, but you know, it doesn't have to. I had this idea in my head it was going to have a death grip on it, the way I hold it between my knees, but this works just fine. So, now that I have a way to hold this, it's actually easier to do. So, thank you, Patricia, for your excellent idea. I wouldn't have thought of this otherwise. So, to move on, I've started this hat, and I started it exactly as we started the hat in Lesson 13, by casting on stitches, and the first 2 stitches of the row, I used both my working yarn and my tail together on the first 2 stitches. Remember that on your second row that you need to knit, you know, those first 2 stitches will have 2 loops of yarn. So now I've knitted in stockinette, so front stitch, for 5 inches. And I mean this measurement. From just under the hoop to the end of the hat. And I think that's going to be plenty. I think my mistake with my other red hat over there is that I went too far. So, we're going to try another one. So, but anyway, now I'm to the part where I'm going to shape the crown of the hat. And lesson number 2 here, I didn't save myself enough yarn to finish my hat, but I'm just going to start another color. So the crown of my hat is going to be a different color than the body. And this is where you begin to shape your crown. So this has taken me 12 rows. This is going to be lesson 13, row 13. And this is my first row of decreasing. Now, the pattern I took this from is an adaptation of a pattern I got online. And I have found through numerous experiments with this, it doesn't really matter if your numbers come out. You'll never notice that when you get to the crown. And I'll show you just a second. Let me grab this other hat. So in this hat, the one I made previous to the one I'm doing now, you cast on 32 stitches. When I got to my decreasing rows, my numbers didn't really work out. I had some spare stitches that I just had to knit in my decreasing rows. It doesn't matter. Nobody's going to look at this hat. I mean, if you could see it dead on, it wouldn't be totally accurate, but nobody's ever going to see the hat that way. I don't think it matters. I mean, I can't find a reason that that is a problem, other than the fact that the hat is too big. So, let me just show you how this works out. And like I say, I wouldn't worry about the numbers. Whatever you need to cast on, I think will work. And the whole thing initially is done in stockinette. Once you've knit your 5 rows then, you can begin your crown shaping. So, I already clicked my clicker, so I know this is row 13. But for this part, it doesn't really matter. So, because now I'm starting my decrease. So I'm going to reset my clicker now, because I think it's easier for me to keep track of these decreasing rows. And I'm going to reset it to 1. And my first decreasing row, and let me turn around here. My first decreasing row is I'm going to first knit 3 stitches. So just like I showed you between your knees, you're going to try to push these around. As you're pushing, you might even want to put your finger over the tube so you don't push them all the way off. So now you knit 3. So just as we did in the previous video, take your stitch off. It should look like this if it's stockinette. Your yarn goes under the stitch. You grab it with your left hand and pipe it on the right. Take off a second stitch, pull it through, pipe it on the right. I like to keep my yarn in my right hand, take off the stitch with my left, then just push the yarn into the stitch basically, grab the new stitch, put it on the hoop. So now there's 3. Now I have to knit 2 together. And just as I showed you in lesson 13, I think it's easier to take them off one at a time. So now I have knit 1, these are knitting 2 together, so I have to take off 2. And here's a second one. Push your working yarn through to make your new stitch. And I'm going to repeat this all the way around my knitting hoop. So now I have to knit 3. Now I knit 2 together. Again, I'm taking my yarn over my index finger, pushing it basically through that first stitch, and then taking off a second one and laying it over. I think it's easier to get the yarn through there. So now I've knit 2 together, and I will knit 3 again. Knit 2 together, so there's 1, 2, this is where the size of the hoop matters. In the first hat I showed you, in lesson 13, it didn't matter so much because when you got to your decreasing row, you just halved it and cast off. But this time, you're getting down to a fewer number of stitches. There was my knit 2 together. So I would say use a hoop that allows you to get your stitches on without them being crammed, but without too much space between the stitches. Because for a hat like this, that you're doing a shaped crown, you're going to find your hat is starting to get stretched out. Now you can see my hoop holder, and that was a little tricky getting that through. If you have a little trouble, you start to lose your working yarn, you can do this. Notice how I'm putting my finger through those stitches first. Now I'm following it with the yarn. That's another way you could do it. You'll see there's a little play in here. I could put a sticky mat in there, or I could say I think a better solution is to make the wall of this just a little taller by about 1.25 inches. So that's another way you could do it. But the cardboard works fine too, and it's free, so works just as well actually. But this way you won't have to hold it between your knees. And for Patricia, this was the best alternative for her because her back was just killing her doing this. So now I've done 3. Now look, this time it actually worked out. I'm going to end with 2, knit 2 together. But not every row and not every stitch count that you cast on is going to work out that way. This time it didn't. Actually, I didn't even work the numbers first. I just assumed it wasn't going to work out. There's my knit 2 together. Alright, so that was my first row of my shaping. And now I do my second row of my shaping. And this one I just knit. So take your stitch marker, put it over to the right. You can move your knitting around if you want. Now I have, well, I'm not going to count them, but I have fewer stitches. So let's just move on. This row is just a straight knit row. Again, I like to keep, you can find other ways of doing this if they're more comfortable. I caution you against one thing when you make your stitch and carry it over. Make sure you're not putting it over those stitches. Make sure they're just your new stitches going against them. If you cross your stitches up and don't notice that when you knit them, you'll make a mess. Well, you might make something interesting, but it won't be what you intended. Let's say that. That would be like maybe how you could cable something, but that's not for today. And now that we're into spring, maybe you're not even going to be making hats. But I wanted to show you this because I think this makes a really cute hat. And again, I'm having a little difficulty getting, just figuring out the right sizes. Some yarn stretches more. I think the wool has more elastic recoil, so it stays a little snugger. Or something like an acrylic maybe stretches out. The size of your hoop is going to also be determined by the thickness of your yarn. So if you're using a very heavy fat yarn, this is supposed to be a 6, but there's plenty of 6 bulkies that are. Notice I put my thumb over the end of the tube. I'm just knitting all the way around. Again, this is basically a front stitch. You can transpose lots of easy patterns. There's tons on the internet. Look for patterns for bulky yarn. Those will be the simplest and the closest to this gauge. Okay, you've completed your second row for your crown. Again, I move my stitch marker over, move your knitting. This is row 3. In this round, I'm going to knit 2, then knit 2 together. So you can see what's happening here. With each successive round in which I decrease, the crown is getting smaller because I'm knitting 2 together more often. Just knit 2 together, and then just knit 1 and 2. Now I'm pulling these almost too tightly. You wouldn't have to snug them this tight, but be consistent. And I think the more you do it, the more, you don't want them so tight on there that you can't move them along the hoop. And of course you're going to stop and move them along the hoop more often when you're decreasing. So there's my knitting 2 together. If you think you've messed up, there I knit 2 together. You can always kind of go back and look and separate this and see that this was a knit 1, knit 1. Here on this new stitch I have 2, so I know I knit 2 together here. Knit 1, knit 1. Here, again, here's my new stitch. I don't know if you can see this, but here's 1 stitch, here's 2 stitches. Here's a knit 1. I only have 1 stitch around there. 1 stitch. Here's 2. So if you think you've lost track or made a mistake, that's how you can double check. And I'm just going to continue in this manner. This whole decrease takes 7 rows. And by the time I get done to my 7th row, then I will do just as I showed you in lesson 13. I will cut the yarn. I'll leave myself about 10 inches of yarn or so, and cut the yarn, put it through my knitting, my yarn needle, and I will come along and take my stitches with the yarn needle, and then I will, once I have the yarn woven back through, I'll start over moving to the left and around. Then I can go ahead and take my knitting off my hoop, pull it snug, and then I'll take the yarn to the other side and weave it in. And I'd be done, and that's how you do a shaped crown hat.